Happy Tuesday, everybody. It is Jeff here with True Crime, Myths, Legends, and more. And hopefully you've been enjoying all the stuff that we've had. This is episode 5. And tonight we are going to be talking about a whole bunch of things with an incredible guest we have tonight. I was fortunate enough to get to talk with him probably over a year ago now. About the Gacy case and all the things that were happening around that. When I was writing Beyond the Headlines, I actually went to Bill and asked him for some help on a few things to clarify some things. And this is a guy that can pull out the evidence right away, review it, and send it to you. So it has been great getting to know him and getting to know his whole story and everything that is involved with that. So tonight, we're going to be talking about both John Wayne Gacy and all the things and the things that may not have gone on with that whole case. And we're also going to talk about Ronaldo Guevera, which is another case that William Dorsch got to work on. Well, not a case that he got to work on, but something that he experienced through his time being a detective. He is now a retired detective with the Chicago Police Department. And spent a lot of time, got to see a lot of things, and you will get to hear from him directly now. So let me bring him up on stage. By the way, if you haven't had a chance, and I'll put this in the comments below, or not in the comments, in the description below, but you need to check out his book. He's actually got another one coming out here soon, but and I'm sure he'll tell us about it. But this one right here called Omnipotent. It is, I thought it had it on the cover, but there's a byline in there. Bill will tell us. But Omnipotent is about all of the stuff around the Gacy case and all the things that were going on in Chicago at the time. And it really goes through all of his evidence that he had collected over the years and years. And the one unique thing about Bill is that he knew Gacy, had dinner at his house, knew him. And so it is a very, very unique story to hear that. If you haven't heard it before, and if you haven't already picked up his book, make sure you do that. But without further ado, William Dorsch. How's it going, Bill?
Hey, Jeff, doing good? Good to hear you again.
Absolutely, man. It's always good to get together with you. We don't do it nearly enough.
Yeah, we're all busy.
I'm certainly always one of the ones lurking in the background, watching all the episodes that you guys are putting out. And it's always incredible. There were several episodes that were put out, and some of the people that were connected with the Gacy story, family members and stuff, people that had experienced things around some of the cases came on, and you get to hear directly from them, which is incredible. So if you guys get a chance, Defense Diaries has a season 2. Bill is on there, and they go on there and they talk about all the things ongoing around Gacy and the things that are currently being investigated, which is just incredible. So Bill, give a little introduction, better than the one I can give.
Okay. Well, first off, hello, folks. Thanks for joining us tonight. I am a retired Chicago police homicide detective. I'm long time retired already, but I was there during some of the most very interesting years. I wrote a book about John Wayne Gacy, and I didn't write that book until many years later because there was a lot of investigation that needed to be done. And the title of my book, Omnipotent, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Okay? But I chose the title Omnipotent because by definition it means godlike, assuming the power of God. And from what I've found through my investigation and other things during my career, government can be a real problem. They tell us what's right and wrong. They tell us who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. They have complete control of many of the laws that we may not like, but we have to abide by because they created the law. we're the guy that's going to be called wrong. They're always going to be right. All right. So what I found out is that, well, first off, let me go to this. As a police officer, especially as a homicide investigator, you owe your best effort to the family of the victim, to get the answers. That's what an investigation is about, to seek the truth. All right. If you find out the truth and you bury it and you never tell it, you're doing the wrong thing. And government sometimes wants you to hide the truth for reasons of their own. I mean, if you're in the Chicago area, you probably know about Mayor Daley's nephew. It took 10 years before they arrested him and charged him with a death case. 10 years. But they were afraid to go to his door and knock on the door and make a case out of it because of the connections. Sometimes in Chicago, when you're on the police department and the detectives arrive at the crime scene, and if you find out there's a connection to somebody of importance, suddenly that case is taken away from you. Yeah. It's the type of case that will wake up the chief of detectives at home at night. It'll wake up the superintendent. They'll get dressed and they'll be coming down to the scene themselves. Okay, things that are usually not ever done. But as a detective, you're hampered by that because they've taken that case away from you. And Laquan McDonald is another case where the kid got shot. He had a knife, but he got shot like 20 times. And that investigation was tainted, to say the least. And then the Guevera case, which was another case that I worked on, and I'm now doing, writing a second book, which is going to be called Justice Denied. I've been involved because I was the only Chicago police detective to become aware and suspicious about activities being done by a group of gang crimes officers and some detectives who I was working in the same office with. And I saw that things were not right. And when I had a particular case that was assigned to me and I found out what was wrong with it, and I brought that information to my bosses, only to be told, Bill, don't do anything, just shut up and don't write any reports. And I said, so you want me to put an innocent person in jail for a murder he didn't do just for you, so you can get a clear up? And that's what they did. But now I left the job because of that, not because of Gacy. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what's really fascinating about that, about the Guevara case, on the podcast, when you guys were talking about that, you brought on several of the people that were wrongfully convicted. And the one gentleman that came on that you actually did the lineup for. And that was incredible. You're talking about a guy that he literally picked up off the street, told him, hey, we just need you to be part of this lineup so that you can, we just need people to fill in so that we can get this guy. And they let him go, and then they bring him back in for another one. He thinks it's, the same old thing because apparently they did that a bunch. And he ends up getting charged with murder and going away to prison for years and years. And there's how many people have been exonerated that Guevara?
Well, over 40 now. I think we're close to 46 right now. And I've testified in many of those cases, both in civil cases in the Cook County Court and federal cases also. But We've gotten almost 40 people out who were wrongfully convicted. But, here's the situation like with Jacques Rivera. His case was in 1988, all right? There was a shooting, and it was unsolved for a while. They had one known witness who was a 14-year-old kid who really wasn't a witness, but he was in the vicinity, and he was on paper as being possible witness to the crime. The bad cops from gang crimes, Guevara and Company, convinced this kid that they knew who the offender was in the case and that he needed to help the police by picking him out of the lineup. All right. So the kid cooperated with these policemen, not knowing the truth. But when he was done and the case went to court and the guy got convicted. All those years later, that kid kept thinking about, I never really saw the offender. They were telling me I had to testify that this was the guy. So when Northwestern University law students finally went out there 20 some years later and talked to him, and he right away said, "Look, I know why you're here. You're here about that Jacques Guevara case that I testified to. He didn't do it. I don't know who did it." And then they were able to get him exonerated. But that was a snowball. I testified in that case in the federal court. I testified for 2 days in the federal civil trial where Jacques Guevara, exonerated already, was suing the city of Chicago. And I testified for 2 full days while detectives that I had worked with, and detective sergeants, were sitting there as defendants, and they took the Fifth Amendment.
Wow.
Not to testify. And of course, my reputation was long gone anyway, because I was the one who raised the flag, basically.
Yeah.
But I testified over and over and over again. And I'll tell you this, I brought cases. I've been asked by families of some of these kids who were they're in jail for 20 some years now, and then the family came to me and says, "Can you help me?" And so I did the investigation and believed in their innocence. And the thing I always told the families was, I believe the bad guy should be in jail. If he's the bad guy and he's guilty, he should be in jail. So if your son's, if the evidence tells me that that's what it is, I'm not going to make up something for you. But if I believe in the case and if I believe in his innocence, I will take your case to some attorney or to the law school, Northwestern or City of Chicago or University of Wisconsin, wherever I need to go with it, and introduce that case to them and tell them, you have to look at this case. And so that's what I've done in several cases. I brought the cases to them, and the lawyers picked it up, or the law schools picked it up, and they've worked it and gotten the exoneration. But I testified in so many of those cases, and I feel good about it. I felt great putting a good case together and putting the bad guy in prison. But who do you serve, Jeff, if you knowingly arrest and convict an innocent man and put him in prison? Why are you doing that? Is it just for stats? Well, I'll tell you what I firmly believe, because I lived it as a detective. The city of Chicago turned a blind eye to what was being done by Guevara and company, okay? Because they were clearing crimes. My last year, we had 930 homicides in Chicago. It doesn't look very good if you're not making some arrests and getting some conviction, okay? Even on a good year, if you're making 22%, clear-ups, it's considered a good year. But they're taking cases, they didn't know who the offender was, but they got these guys coming in with a case saying, we got witnesses that we in the detective division didn't even know of these witnesses a lot of times. Suddenly, this group of gang crimes officers were finding people that were witnesses, And like in the one case a couple years later, similar to the Jacques Guevara case, when Guevara and his partner Steve Geyers walked into the station with 2 young teenage Latino boys and an older Latino guy, and they walked into the boss's office, talked to him, and then my boss come out and said, "Hey, Bill, Guevara and his partner, they got a couple witnesses here to that, 4 or 5 week old homicide that we had no information on, who are saying they saw the homicide and can identify the shooter." Okay, but I've been watching this group already. I was suspicious of it. So what happens was, he says, you work with Guevara and his partner and take it up. So the story is, as I sit down with Guevara, he says, well, we were on patrol tonight and we saw these 2 boys that we brought in and wanted to talk to them about homicides and shootings in the area. And lo and behold, they told us they saw that homicide where the guy got shot in the car under the viaduct. Okay? They were close enough that they were able to not only see the license plate number, but they had a pen and paper on them and were able to write the number down. Now, okay, I told my boss after talking to Guevara and his partner, you're telling me Do you want me to believe Guevara and guys who tell me that weeks later, 4 or 5 weeks after the homicide, not only do you have two Latino boys who are out in the street early in the morning, which I don't have a problem with Chicago Humboldt Park. If being out there at 2, 3 in the morning in the summer, not a problem. But when you tell me one of them's got a pen and a piece of paper on it, and then when you, the police, stop them 4 or 5 weeks later, they still have it on them. I don't believe it. And my boss would say, oh, Bill, no, run the plate, see where it goes. So I run the plate, and Jeff, the guy comes back with 1 arrest, and it is for a gun. You know, it is for a gun. So I have to step back myself, and he lives in the neighborhood, and I think, oh, okay, I got to look at this. So I tell Guevara and his partner to go down to headquarters to pick up a photo from that gun arrest, okay? But I keep the 2 boys with me, all right? So they leave mysteriously with the 3rd guy who just sat in the hall and had no input, okay? And when they came back, Guevara wanted to go right in the room where the 2 boys were, and I stopped them. I says, no, give me the photo. And I took the photo, and I put a photo array together, you know, with 4 or 5 other photos. So the kids never saw it. And then I took my partner and I, with Guevara, his partner, and the 2 boy witnesses, we went into the large room that we have in the back, and I instructed both boys. I said, listen, you say you were a witness to this homicide. I don't know if that's true or not, but if you were a witness, you're going to see some photos. I'm going to put them out here. But just because you're going to look at a group of photos does not mean that I have the guy that you saw in this group of photos. I may not have him here. So only tell me if you're positive in making an identification. If not, tell me. Okay? So I tell the 1 boy and guards to go in the corner so they can't see what we're doing. And I call the boy up, and Guevara comes walking up with him. And he was standing next to the kid, and I put out the 5 or 6 photos. And the kid must have spent a minute, maybe a little more, looking at the photos. And he's not saying anything. And I'm not rushing him, Jeff, because everybody's different. Some people need a little more time. And I'm fine with that because I want you to be positive, okay? And suddenly, Guevara just reached out, put his finger right on the photo and says, that's him. And the kid goes, yeah, that's him. He looks a little different, maybe the hair, maybe something. I said, what? Whoa, right away. I said, Guevara, you and the kid get out of the room. And I made a mistake there. I should not have let them go out together, okay? But I threw them out of the room. I mixed up the photos, brought the other kid up, and Gars came up with him, and he had heard the same instruction. And he's looking at the photos, and after a while, he says, I can't identify anybody. Okay, so I take that identification back to my boss and say, hey, I don't like the way this went down. You know, the kid's supposed to make the identification, not Gars. You know, I mean, not Guevara. And my boss says, well, no, Bill, call the state's attorney and see what he says. So the state's attorney comes down, and I'll be honest with you, I don't think that I told the state's attorney about Guevara pointing out the picture because I had no real reason. I mean, it's wrong. Everybody knows it's not the right thing to do, but I'm in a room with only my partner and another copper, and do I really want to try to ruin somebody's career without knowing the real reason behind what happened? Maybe he just did a stupid impulse thing, frustration, whatever. I didn't know. So I don't think I told the state's attorney, but the state's attorney said, well, what you got to do, Bill, which I knew, you got a photo ID from one kid, but not the other. You got to go pick up that kid and bring him in for a lineup. So, okay, it's late. We send the kids home. Guevara and his partner leave. The next day, me and my partner come into work. Us and Sergeant Mingy, we go out to the house where the kid lives. That because the car incident. I mean, they said the license plate number we had was to a car in the neighborhood, and the car was parked out front. Okay, with that license plate number. So we knocked at the door of the apartment. The kid comes down the stairs, and he's about 20 years old. And right away, I mean, he comes to the door. He's dressed in a dress shirt, He might have even had a tie on, I'm not sure, and dress pants. And we introduced ourselves as police and said, we need to talk to you. And he said, sure, come on up. And we go upstairs with him to his apartment. And he had been sitting at the dining room table. And on the table, he had his course books where he was going to night school at Chicago University at night. And he's assistant manager at a Walgreens. And he's a young kid, all right?
Yeah.
And he's also got his checkbook out and he's paying his bill, okay? And I'm thinking,
Wow.
This is not the gangbanger that I think I'm going to find at this location. But he's got the gun arrest. And now we got the car license plate number. So we said, well, we have an incident that involves a shooting in the area, and somebody wrote down your license plate number, and we have to talk to you to see if you are involved in this. And he says, sure, no problem. I didn't do anything. So he comes into our office, and of course, now we call and have the lineup. And we have the lineup with the same two kids, and of course, the kid that had Guevara pick him out for him, he can now pick out the guy out of the lineup. No surprise.
Yeah.
And now the other guy that couldn't, he still can't identify anybody. But now the state's attorney comes in and says, oh, no, we got one ID, charge him. I'm not comfortable with it, but what are you going to do? All right. State's attorney leaves, everybody leaves, me and my partner, we take the kid, we do the arrest report, we take him down to the lockup and leave him there for processing. We go back upstairs to start our reports. And what happens is suddenly the father of the boy that we just arrested comes walking in. And he inquires of us, is my son here? You know, Robert Ramos, is he here? Because I was told he was come in with the police. And he said, yes, sir, and he's in serious trouble. And he says, what kind of trouble? And I says, well, he has identified his involvement in a homicide from in the area close to your home. And the father, he almost collapsed to the floor. I mean, I grabbed him, you know, to help steady him. And he said, my son's a good kid. He's a good kid. He works. He goes to school. He wouldn't do anything like that. And I said, well, I hate to, but what about the gun arrest, sir? He's got a gun arrest. You know, he's not, you know, lily white. He has an arrest here. And the father said, did you talk to him about that arrest? And I said, no, I didn't. You know, he says, would you talk to him? He says, what do I need to do? I said, well, sit down. I'll go down and talk to your son. I went down. I called the kid to the cage, and I asked him, tell me about the gun arrest. And he says, well, I'm riding in my car with two friends of mine, and we're driving through an alley in the daytime by my house. And right there in the middle of an alley is a revolver laying there. He says, so I stopped the car. I got out. I picked it up. I examined the gun. And I thought years later, I'm thinking, I thought he said it wasn't loaded. And I thought he said the frame was broken. But it wasn't the frame. It was the serial number on the gun was removed. But he said, I did a stupid thing. I didn't want to leave the gun there in the middle of the alley. There's a lot of kids around. He says, I threw it in the trunk of the car. I drove out of the alley. I turned, went about a block. Squad car pulled me over, searched the car, found the gun, and we all got charged. All three guys in the car got charged with the gun.
Wow.
So I come back up, and I told the father, okay, I talked to your son about that arrest and all that. And the father says, what do I do? Do I get an attorney? Do I need to get an attorney? I said, well, sir, it's a homicide case, but I'll tell you this. Tomorrow morning is going to be his first appearance in the trial courts in branch 66. I says, go to the courtroom, but don't get an attorney yet. All right? Don't get an attorney. Go to the courtroom. I says, we're going to be there. So he leaves, and I told my partner, this whole thing stinks. I don't like it. The kids have this license plate number in their pocket 5 weeks later. You know, I can't go with this. And then Guevara put his finger on so I said, we're going to pick up the kids in the morning, and we're going to talk to them, and then we're going to go to court. So we pick up the two kids, independent of each other, and I lay it on each of them. I said, listen, I don't believe any of this crap. You know, the story you're telling about seeing it and having the paper, writing it down, and then when the police stop you, got it. And the first guy fesses up right away. The guy that said that was the guy that made the identity. Said, we only did it, he says, because everybody knows these coppers. We're afraid of them. We're afraid of them. And they threatened us all the time. And we were afraid that if we didn't do what they wanted, we were going to be the next guys in trouble.
Yep.
Okay. So pick up the other guy, and he too says the same thing. And I think he was the one that added, and they gave us $20 each to lie. Okay.
Golly.
And so when I took him down to branch 66 and I talked to the attorney who was going to be handling the case in the first time up in the courtroom, and I said, you're going to talk to these two kids. They were the supposed witnesses in the arrest of this guy that's going to be in court today. And they never saw this homicide. They lied. I want you to talk to them and listen to the story. So after that, state attorney says, yep, we're going to have to release them. We're going to have to release them. And it had to be done that day because, Jeff, if it had gone past that day, that kid would be in court for God knows how long, sitting in jail.
Yeah.
Right? But what happened was they going to release him from the court. Me and my partners drove the two kids back home, and we drove back to our office, walked up through the door, and immediately saw all the bosses, the chief for Area 5, the lieutenant for Area 5, a couple sergeants, standing right outside the violent crimes office. And I walk up, and the first words out of the boss's mouth is, Dorsch, what the frick are you doing? We're never going to solve this case. And so I said, so you want me to put an innocent kid in jail so you can clear a homicide case for statistics? And then about a half an hour later, he came out and said, this is the way it is. You do not write any reports. No reports. We're going to say that you did get a CB number, and we'll be able to clear the case on a CB, and we'll write the reports. Okay? So I wish I had only that. I never was at the crime scene, didn't do the original investigation. It was similar to the Rivera case where weeks later I'm asked to start with a lineup. So I had no real connection to witnesses and people or the location even. Okay. So I had a hard time years later when I was asked about Guevera and I brought up this case, being exact about the location. Even knowing when I became a detective, I'm searching for the year, or who I was working with on the day that this happened. Because, I didn't want to be testifying in a courtroom and saying anything that was not correct because it's going to come back.
Oh,
all right. So I'd rather say I don't remember than I don't know. But I was able to research everything out, and now I know for certain everything. So that when I started going into the courtroom with confidence, I would testify and tell the story. And it was easy for me to do over and over because I was doing it over and over and over again. And when you're repeating the truth, it's not hard to remember.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the thing that's really, important about this whole thing is Guevara has never been charged, right?
Well, there's good reason for that. Because if you put Guevara and the others in the courtroom, and I say others because he's not alone.
Yeah.
All right. If you charge him, the city's going to be on trial too. The Chicago Police Department is going to be on trial. The bosses, those that are still alive, are going to be named in that case. They're going to all be called back to testify.
Yeah. So this guy,
I'm not the only detective that saw what was going on.
Yeah.
Right. And even after that, this is like we're in October. Halloween is coming. This is a horror story. Yep. That incident where Guevara put the finger on the photo, and I got the kid released. A couple weeks later, Guevara and his partner Gars get meritoriously promoted to detective and sent to work in the same office where I am.
Wow.
And I'm trying to stay away from any connection to anything he does, but I'm watching. And so are others. And I'm not alone talking about it, but I'm the only guy that ever testified about it. So I did it, and I did it because it was the right thing to do. I cannot see that, there's a family out there that lost a kid, or a daughter, a kid, whatever, that wanted justice. And you didn't get it for them if you locked up an innocent person. But see, the other thing about it was Guevara, and company were working with a guy named Joe Majanowski, who's doing life in prison. Do you know about him?
No, no.
Joe Majanowski was a gang crimes officer that in 2001 was finally arrested by the federal government and tried for his running a drug operation while a Chicago police officer, but he was the only one they charged. They could have charged Guevara and others, but they only won.
You know what's amazing about that? Have you ever seen that movie Training Day with yeah. And you look at that and it could almost be the Guevara story. Like there's a cop, a detective that's out there that's running all of this stuff. And when you start talking about that guy that gets arrested and charged federally and is in prison because he was doing exactly that, out there selling drugs, and who else was involved in that, right? And who else was involved in, setting other people up to take the fall? It's crazy.
And also a quick reference here with John Burge. You know the John Burge cases in Chicago.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, he was the head of the detective group out of Area 1 and 2 on the south side of Chicago. They put many innocent people in jail for murders they didn't do. But the only person they put in prison was Burge. Guevara and company learned not to testify. They took the fifth. Okay, and that's kept them out of jail. But yeah. I believe they still could be charged, the ones that are still alive, and they should for what they did. All right, they made a lot of money because they were part of Majanowski's organization. I started with Bob Mata bringing in witnesses on Guevara, and among the witnesses, many of them I've come to know very well, and they will come in and tell their horror story about how they got arrested. They'll admit, yeah, I was in a gang, but then if you lived in the Humboldt Park area of Chicago during that time, almost every kid was in a gang. Because, Jeff, it was sort of like this. If you're a young boy going, even in grammar school, but really bad when you're going to high school, where you lived was important because certain gangs controlled certain areas. So when you were going off to school in the morning, you looked up and down that street to see who was standing out there before you ever went out the door. All right? Because your life was actually in danger all the time. And going to school was a problem for a lot of kids. A lot of kids quit school because it was the wrong gang running that school.
Yeah.
And they were threatened. Okay. So being in the gang, there was only because of where you lived for a lot of these people. But then again, if you had an older brother who was already in a gang, that's the gang you're going to have to be in.
Yeah. So you don't know this about me because we haven't talked about this, but I'm originally from right outside of Philadelphia. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, right? I grew up on the street, and I was involved in a lot of stuff when I was a kid. I did all kinds of things. I had there was some friends of ours they had a lowrider club there in Wilmington, and we would go to Philly every weekend to go to the shows, right? And so we were the guys that would protect the cars, and we had all the baseball bats and the knives and the guns in the trunk, just in case any of the drug dealers, because 90% of the people that were going to those lowrider shows were all drug dealers. And so we were busy dealing with them. And, that is what I grew up in. That, I learned a lot of stuff running the streets. And, it's, my hometown several years ago was Murder Town, USA, right? Mm-hmm. It had hit numbers, so high across the country. And, people, it's so funny because I came to live here, and I'm in Cincinnati now. But when I came to live here, I worked with kids, and I worked for the Department of Juvenile Justice for some time. And, I'd always get those kids that came in and thought they were real tough and that they were little badasses. And I would always tell them, like, you guys have no idea. Like, you couldn't last 10 seconds going back where I grew up. Like they would have killed you a long time ago. And it's just, it's amazing because it's that way. Like in Chicago, even now, right? There are certain sections, and you got to be a part of that. You don't have a choice. It starts out when you're little, and people don't understand. Like I started out when I was, let's see, I was 8, 9 years old. Like I had a Colombian family that moved next door to me, and I was hanging out with them, and they were selling coke out of their house, right? And so I got involved with a lot of stuff really, really young. And, they like to use kids. They like to get them out there because they can get those kids to do just about anything. Because everybody looks like they have money and they're doing all these things. And, all of the movies that came out, of course, when I was a kid, you had The Godfather and you've got Scarface. And that was a huge thing in the gang culture. Everybody looked up to that. So you had this kind of this pie in the sky idea of what the life was like, and people would portray that. They would try to act that way so that they can get the kids involved, because the kids could be mules and they could do stuff and they wouldn't go to jail. And so they use that a lot. They get kids in that are really young, and then they become older and older. And then when they get old enough, they go to jail and they spend their time there because of the associations that they have.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I have quite a varied background.
But it's so true, the culture at that time. And like you said, kids didn't have a choice. They were always in danger, So, but that's the Guevara story. I'm still working on that. And yes, my second book, which Justice Denied, I'm open to get it out by the end of November.
Nice.
We'll tell the story of my involvement in that. And I don't pull any punches in it, believe me. And the Gacy case too. I wrote the book, but there's still more there, Jeff. There's still more. I mean, the city of Chicago, they didn't want more bodies. I mean, once they dug up that first body under the house, no, they didn't know what they were going to find. They were looking for Peace, for Robert Peace Boy. They had no idea they were going to be the cemetery of graves there. Nobody knew. I had dinner at Gacy's house, for Christ's sake. My wife came home one day, and it started with this. She came home from her job with this insurance company and said, "Oh, this guy, John Wayne Gacy, invited us to have dinner at his house with his wife and kids." So, didn't know the guy. I don't think my wife ever mentioned his name before. All right. So we went to the house, my wife, me, my one son, who was only about 3 at the time, and she was pregnant with my second son. And we spent probably 4 or 5 hours in that house with John Gacy, his second wife, Carol, and the 2 kids. And maybe either his mother or her mother might have been in the house at that time too. And I remember a house, I've been in many hundreds of houses, but there were certain things about that house, and I was only in it once, that I had vivid recall of. It's kind of funny. I still remember. The pool table, the bar, that kind of stuff was easy. But I remember a painting on a wall. It was the type of painting at the time it was popular, where it was like felt, but it had actually electrical lighting in it.
Interesting.
Like the street lights would light up, or a house lights would light up.
Oh yeah.
And I remember this being on the living room wall, and I remember another one like a Spanish conquistador with a helmet and maybe a sword or something. I remember that. But I spent 4 or 5 hours there with the guy. And when you meet people for the first time, of course, you share an interest in each other. You ask questions. And he asked me, he knew I was a policeman because of my wife, and I had already been in the newspaper for some stuff that happened. I did. And so he knew I was a cop. But while we were playing pool, I remember him coming out behind the bar, and he walked up to me with a pair of handcuffs. And he said, "Bill, you want to see a handcuff trick?" And I said, John, I said, I was in the academy, 2.5, 3 years ago, and every day when I was there in training, I was putting handcuffs on somebody or they were putting them on me. John, I know the trick. You got to have the key. Okay. So he laughed. He went back. He put the the handcuffs away. And he come back with a revolver to show me the gun. And I said, hey, John, I have gun. I got a gun with me now. I don't pull the gun out, especially when there's children around. I don't, no, put it away. So, but we talked, and he asked, well, where do you live, Bill? And I said, well, I live in Chicago, near the area where Elston and Milwaukee meet. He says, oh, really? He says, you know where Miami Avenue is? I said, yeah, it's right around the corner from where I live. He says, the big apartment building over there, the 5-unit apartment building, I take care of that property. What do you? So you take care of it? What do you mean? He said, I the gardening, and I do any kind of little construction work they need. I do. If he had been there before, I never noticed him. I had no reason to pay attention to him. And I walked out my back of my apartment building once or twice a day with my dog to take my dog for his walk and then bring him back. Or I would drive in and out of the alley in my car. And when I was driving out of the alley, I'm driving right at the apartment building right in front of me. And yes, now because I knew Gacy, I would have small, short conversations with him. I mean, because I was at his house and I had an enjoyable time. I had no idea anything was amiss with him, that he was a bad guy. Certainly not a serial killer. All right. But I had no reason. I didn't bond with him as a friend. Okay. So I knew of him being there, and now I pay attention to him. I'd see him always with young boys there. Okay. But he even came over to my house less than a year later to do some repair work in our apartment that we were living in. There was a broken glass window in the bathroom. And my wife had called the owner of the apartment building. He told her, if you can find somebody who can fix it, have them do it, send me the bill. So Gacy came over with a young boy, about 17, 18 years old. And he explained to the kid what needed to be done. He says, I'll come back in a couple hours and pick you up when you're done. And he came back. All right. And the kid was done with the job. I was satisfied. Everybody was satisfied with the work that was done. And we all walked down the stairs out to the back parking lot together, and small talk. And John invited me again. Bill, why don't you stop over at the house someday? We can watch a ball game, have a few beers. And I said, yeah, sure, John. Yeah, maybe I will. I never did. Okay. I don't know what would have happened. I can only surmise, but I didn't go. But anyway, now we moved from that apartment to another location, but now I'm at work one day, and my wife in December of 78, she calls me to work and she says, Bill, what's the news? John Gacy just got arrested. I said, I know the name now, Gacy, the guy over here? Yeah. They said he's involved in some murders. And every day the story is building. More bodies. Everybody's watching nightly news, cameras everywhere. Police are dragging out these bodies in tarps and throwing them in the back of the paddy wagon to go to the morgue. And they're telling people, the news media, the police are telling people, if you have information about missing people, missing kids, contact the police. Tell us. If you have information about locations, tell us. Well, I'm at work now, and I'm telling people, I had dinner at this guy Gacy's house. Only one time was I there, but now I'm telling them also, this had occurred when I was still living there. I didn't tell you this part. One day, one early morning, we used to get off at 2 a.m. So after 2, maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, when I'm going to park my car in the rear of the house, I have to pass the building that Gacy works at. And suddenly Gacy steps out between two parked vehicles, and I see him, and I recognize him immediately. And it's 3 o'clock in the morning. So I stopped, I rolled down my window. He recognizes me. He comes walking up, and he's holding a long spaded shovel. All right. So I said, John, what the fuck? It's 3 o'clock in the morning. What are you doing? And he sort of laughed and said, Bill, not enough hours in the day. You got to get it done when you can. And I probably laughed, and I went home. But now when she's calling me up and we're watching the news every day, I said, maybe that incident where I saw him there in the morning, maybe it's important because I know it's a spade and shovel. It's not a garden hose, a bag of groceries, anything like that. He doesn't live there, and he's got a long garden. I mean, a long shovel. So I told all my bosses and everybody I'm working with, we were a tactical team, 8 guys and a sergeant. Everybody knew. I'm telling the story. I had dinner at this guy's house. Why wouldn't I tell anybody? All right. So I also knew that the crime happened in outside the city of Chicago, okay, in a small suburban community. So I knew that the Des Plaines Police Department had made the arrest, but I knew that the Sheriff's Department from Cook County had taken over the case. So I called right away to the Cook County Sheriff's Department to say, hey, Bill Dorsch, I'm a policeman here in the 19th District. I think this might be important. Maybe it's not, but I think you should know about it. I think you should go to this location and talk to the people who live in the building. Maybe they have something to tell you. It might be of value. And I told them about seeing Gacy with the shovel and all this. And the officer who's talking to me says, Bill, we have enough bodies. We don't want any more. Thank you. And hangs up the phone. Well, years later, I remember in the court, maybe 1 or 2 times I heard, somebody asked me, well, the city attorney said, do you remember the officer you talked to at the Sheriff's Department? And I quite frankly said, sir, I wish I did. I don't remember. I know it was a male. I know it wasn't a female. But I think it was more important for that officer to remember me than for me to remember him. You know? But nobody ever came to Bill Dorsch and said, what about this information? Because they did not want any more bodies.
Yeah.
And my book, and which is, you know, Omnipotent, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You can get it on Amazon. Tells the story of everything that I did and what they did to prevent me from gaining information. And I introduced people to other accomplices and victims and locations of victims in that book. And although I'm satisfied with what I wrote, there's still more.
Yeah.
There's still more. And I don't have the time right now. It's sort of on the backlog to do that as I'm working on the Guevera cases. But believe me, you know, you think, how could government not want to find every possible body, anybody related? I mean, Gacy everybody says he kept meticulous records. When they went into the house after he was arrested, they gathered that is evidence, okay? You would think that you would want to identify every young man or anybody that worked for Gacy to determine whether they're alive, dead, or missing. And they didn't.
That's crazy.
And if they would have found one guy in particular, what's his name? Oh, Paskey is his last name. If they would have checked out on him, they would have found out he already had a homicide arrest. You definitely got to go talk to this guy.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have been hard to find because he was working with a city job in Chicago. Okay? But they never went to talk to these people. I was chasing people down 25 and 30 years later. And they're telling me, no, they never talked to me. They never talked to me, you know. But yeah, they worked for Gacy. And then everybody knows about the clown costume. Gacy would dress up as a clown. And one of Michael Rossi, who was one of the kids that lived with Gacy, I told you before, I didn't tell your listeners. The thing about Michael Rossi was important. And I've talked about this in my book too. When you think of Muhammad Ali, known as the greatest prize fighter of all time, all right, you think, wow, what did it take to be Muhammad Ali? But then you look at Muhammad Ali, he had 5 losses amongst all his victories. Gacy certainly wasn't 33-0 by himself. Okay? I knew the man, seeing him as around the apartment now all the time and having been at his house. He was just barely taller than me, and he was punching out of shape when I met him. You know, he was certainly not going to be able to control every one of these kids by himself. And Michael Rossi was of great interest because what happened was when my old homicide boss learned that I had talked to the Better Government Association and that they were interested in the Gacy case, he said, "Bill, you've been talking about this a long time. Let's see what we can find out." So I went out and who better to go to than to Joe Kosenczak, who led to the investigation for the city at this point. And I met with him several times. And he told me that he and Terry Sullivan, the state attorney involved in the case, they were there at the Des Plaines police station. Gacy had not yet been arrested, but they had Michael Rossi in custody in Cranberry, expecting to charge them because they were living there, and he was driving one of the victims' cars.
Yeah.
Okay. And they heard noise in the outside of the office they were in. So when they went out to investigate, they saw a woman there, and she introduced herself as being the mother of Michael Rossi. And she said to them, "Do you have my son Michael here?" And they said, "Yes, ma'am, we have him here, and he's in real trouble." And she says, "Well, let me tell you this. If you do not release my son today, you will not have a job tomorrow." Now, okay, I'm in Chicago. It's a rough town. I've heard this before, too. You know, I've heard stuff like this thrown around. I know somebody, you know, this, that. But they said, "What are you talking about, lady?" And Joe Kosenczak tells me, she says, "Because my son Michael is the grandson of Vito Marzullo. And Vito Marzullo was the second most powerful politician in the city of Chicago at that time. He was a Chicago alderman." So they went from charging his grandson Michael Rossi to making him a witness against Gacy. Okay, and because they had to let that happen for Michael, David Cram, who also was living and working for Gacy and helping dig the graves and get these kids into the house, they had to let him go too and use him as a witness because you couldn't charge the one and not the other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, that is when you look at the Gacy case and you look at how some of the murders were done, you know, you see that Gacy had a very, very distinct way that he killed people, right?
Right.
You already mentioned the handcuff trick. He liked to use the ligature around the neck, the rope trick. But there were also other victims that were killed not consistent with those methods. Some of them died because
stuffed in the mouth.
Yeah, so you have that as well, and you have to wonder, you know, and of course Gacy himself later on, you know, he said he would go on to tell everybody, well, you know, they all had keys to my house, and you know, I was gone all the time, so you know, but if there were other people involved, maybe he didn't kill all of them. Maybe he did. Maybe he was involved in all of them. And, you know, you got these three guys, and they're not all living there at the same time, but you have Rossi, who is living there, that was clearly had some involvement. And, you know, he went and he would go. And if you read the book and you listen to the podcast, you'll find this out. But he was procuring people for Gacy, right? There's several people that he went and was the one that was, you know, kind of leading them to, oh, I got to introduce you to this guy. And then these people disappeared. So you got to figure if he's bringing them to Gacy, that he's involved in some way. And we know, of course, Gacy also used the torture board, very similar to Dean Corll, and probably got it from the Corll.
He was a good student of Dean Corll.
Yeah,
he was. He learned, and he like Corll, he was a busy guy. Gacy had a very good business going for him, construction business, and Corll with the candy company that his family had. But they both were the same. They realized there aren't enough hours in a day to do all they wanted. They couldn't work as hard as they were working and then be spending time on the street. And like Corll was doing, getting a couple young boys to come back and engage in sex with him first, and then enticing them to bring a friend over, and then that kid gets killed, and now suddenly he's able to say to you, hey, you brought him here. You're involved.
Yeah.
And I believe it's very similar to what happened. And I talked to one of the two boys in the Corral case about how that all went down. So I'm pretty sure that's what it went. But
yeah, it's the same thing. Wayne Henley, Elmer Wayne. I've had some communication with him. I wrote. One of my friends is really good friends with him, and that is it's a very interesting case because there is a certain amount of that, like you were just talking about, how Dean would really hang that over their head, and he would use that to get them to do things. And yeah, I'm not so sure that isn't any different with Gacy.
Right, he's got him. He's got him not only bringing boys back there, but he's got him. He's digging the holes where the bodies are going.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, you've got knowledge, and then we have a couple like Rignall who said that there was another party in there assaulting him at the same time Gacy was. You know, but those cases were pushed aside. The police department didn't follow. The Chicago Police Department had a lot to be embarrassed by. First off, there were a lot of people missing at that time. You know, it's the hippie culture in the 60s and the 70s. Kids were missing all over the country. And having been a young patrolman on the street starting in 71, you'd go to a missing person to take a missing person report. And if it was a young kid under maybe 12, you'd contact your sergeant and you'd start looking a search for him. But if it was somebody older than that, you're pretty much always telling them, oh, they're probably all right. They're probably with friends. They'll come home later when they're ready. And normally that's what happened, you know, and then we tell them when they come home, call the police, let us know they're back, you know, but nobody's looking for the older kid, you know, because a lot of them did go missing on their own or they would come back after a few days. And that's the way it was. But, and also you didn't have computers back in the 70s. In Chicago being the big city that it was, with 5 detective areas, you know, north, south, east, west, central, and, you know, so one area with a missing, maybe even the name Gacy comes up, there was no connection to another area of the city with a missing where a kid or maybe Gacy's name came up. It wasn't connected. Yeah. Okay. So now with computers, that shouldn't have. That shouldn't.
Well, you know, you see that in so many of these cases that came through the 60s and the 70s, even into the 90s, where these police departments were not communicating with one another. And so you didn't have all this VICAP and all this stuff that we have now in these databases that collect this information and give them on a national level. You know, you had just beat cops working this case, and, you know, it really stayed within the department. And it really made it problematic as far as solving crimes, because these guys would learn that you could go and commit a crime here in this area. And even if they have some suspicion, they're probably not going to connect you to the other 15 crimes that you've done over here. And, you know, that really begs the question. You know, Gacy traveled all over the country. This is a guy that whether he killed 33 or 43 or 12 was a killer. And there was no reason for him to ever stop, especially when he had opportunity. So you've got a guy traveling all over the country who is now, you know, there. And his MO is that he, like when he started out, you know, he's going to the bus station. He's picking up these young boys that are coming. He knows exactly what he's doing and how to entice them to come with him. And if somebody believes that he didn't go out to, over to South Dakota or whatever when he was traveling to go and do some work, that he wasn't still looking, because now we know that, of course, he had his 2 wives that lived in the house for some time, but, you know, he was looking for a way to be away from them so that he could go and do his activities.
Right. There was actually 3 parts to Gacy. The first part, when he was out and killing in the early, from 71 to maybe 76, when he divorced Carol. He had the problem of Carol, the kids being there, and his mother or her mother also living there. So he couldn't kill someone there and bury them unless they were all gone. And he encouraged them to leave. Take a trip. Well, go to Tennessee, visit family, do this, do that. And so in the second phase, so during that first phase where he couldn't do it because of them, that's when he was burying bodies at the Miami Avenue apartments. And although they won't search there, I mean, I've got the letter in the book from the radar company that did the scan, okay? And they did the scan at our bequest. My boss, homicide boss, Jim Froon, and the Better Government Association and I contacted this firm to come in because they had been experts already in finding bodies. And they were joined by a guy from England who also was doing that work in Europe. And they searched the body. And in the letter, it says that, well, that first off, there were two searches. The one that we paid them to come in and do the first search, which was not done with permission of the homeowner. But it resulted in them saying to us, yeah, we have evidence, multiple spots here on this property where we believe that bodies could be buried, but you can't be sure until you dig. But with that evidence being given to us, Jim Froon, my old homicide boss, took it to the police department and said, hey, Dorsch has been talking about this a long time, and now we got this radar scan, so it's not just suspicion anymore. All right? This is maybe evidence that there are bodies there. And he came back to me and said, I told them, Bill, they said they were behind you. They know about you talking about this all these years, and they're behind us. Anything we need to do. So I felt, great. We're going to dig it up. So they scheduled reluctantly what the things, it's all in the book. There's a period of months that go by where suddenly I realized where they were going to help, and now suddenly I'm being threatened. Okay. And my family's being threatened. Okay. And so it led to a second search using the same people to come back. And I have the letter from the second search where Bob Labarca said, we were brought back by the city of Chicago to work with them to search the property to look for bodies. And during our search, before our search, we were told there were certain areas on the property that we were not allowed to even scan. And he said that was kind of suspicious. He says, but then we found all these anomalies in the areas in the front lawn that I was allowed, and they were similar to what we had seen in the first search. And he says, we were told, me and the other guy from England were brought into the tent, and the bosses from the police department said, listen, okay, you've got these anomalies, give us two. Two, you should dig up every one of these. They said, no, two. So they said, we picked out two. Then they put us in a car and drove us to the airport. So we weren't even there to know where they searched or if they searched. But they walked away out in the tent later and said, oh, we searched the property and there's no bodies here, case closed. But he said, but in his letter, he says, Bill, there's enough evidence, enough anomalies found on the property that should have sent a trained detective running to a hardware store for a shovel.
Wow.
I mean, what else can you ask for?
And this is the same property where you saw Gacy with the shovel at 3 o'clock in the morning.
It's not only, I mean, there's so much I have in the book to talk about, but I knew people in the building. There was in the very basement apartment, there was a basement apartment and a laundry room adjoining it. And then there was 2 apartments on the first floor and 2 on the second floor. In the basement apartment was another Chicago policeman who worked at the same district where I did, who I grew up with in the neighborhood. I knew him and his wife. I had been in their apartment many times when Gacy was the caretaker. And even when this policeman friend of mine moved into the first home he bought, I helped him move. And the person that moved into the apartment he left was Gacy's mother. And he also, like other people in the building, had contacted the sheriff's department and the Chicago Police Department and said, hey, we believe that maybe there are bodies here because of things that Gacy did. They would tell us stories about Gacy would be here with the young boys, and he would have them dig not holes, but some said spaces, some said trenches, some said like graves. Okay,
Wow.
and these spots were left open, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, and then suddenly you'd go out in the morning and the hole would be filled, and there'd be a single bush or flower in the hole. Now, digging is hard work, and you're planting. We've all done that if you own the home. You don't dig more than you need to plant. And one of the boys, the young boy at the time, whose mother, he lived in an apartment across the street from Gacy, kitty corner from where my apartment was. And his mother was friends with the people in the basement, the policeman family. And he said that he would go over there when he was 7, 8 years old to play with other kids that lived on the street there. And he says he remembers vividly while his mother would be engaged in talking to the woman in the apartment building, that him and his friends would play war games on the front lawn. I said, war games? Yeah, he says we would jump in the trenches and try to pretend to shoot each other from the trenches. And I said, well, how many kids could get in a trench? He said, oh, 2, 3 kids in a trench. He says, at the time, he says, later I realized after Gacy got arrested, he says, and I got older, after having gone to funerals, he says they were just like graves,
Wow.
And these people, I introduced the police to all these witnesses. I have videotaped interviews with all these people that I gave to the police, and they reluctantly took them over a year from the time that I gave them the interviews that they went and talked to these people who lived in the apartment buildings that were witnesses.
Wow.
I mean, I got a lot, Jeff. I don't think we are going to get through it all tonight. Okay. But I'm welcome to come back again if you have the time, if you want to talk more.
Yeah, absolutely, man. You are a wealth of information. You have been right there in the middle of it all. And, I think it's sad how everything has happened and that there's so much that's still there. And you think about that, and you think about if there are, because we know that there are at least 6 of the bodies that they found that are still unidentified, right? That nobody knows who they are. And there are tons and tons of families out there that during that time lost loved ones that disappeared, have never come home. And these people have had to go their whole lives without knowing.
Right.
And it's terrible that they've had to have that void there, that if somebody would take the time, and I know that you've tried to do it, they could get some closure and at least have some understanding of what happened to their families. And it's, because of whatever political bullshit, they don't want to get involved and they don't want to make more of it. They don't want to bring this stuff back.
They want to leave it buried. They buried Gacy and the victims. I mean, there's so much more I can tell you. Like I say, we'll do it. We'll get it done. I mean, absolutely. I thank you, Bob Mata, too, who, I worked with on Defense Diaries. He was very helpful in me getting the story about Gacy out. And I connected with him immediately when I heard about his podcast and recognized that some of his suspicions were some of my suspicions about how Gacy's arrest came to be.
Yeah.
So, more than happy, glad to finally get together with you.
Absolutely, man. It's always good to talk to you. I know it's late where you are, so you should go and get some rest. And I appreciate it, man. I appreciate you coming on and talking about that stuff. We will definitely do it again. We'll dig in a little bit deeper. Maybe we only got 3 feet today, and we still got 3 feet to go.
Sounds good, buddy.
All right, man. So thank you. Thank you. I will talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.
All right. All right, guys. Thank you for joining us for another episode of True Crimes, Myths, Legends, and more. Bill Dorsch, incredible guy, a wealth of information about all of these cases. he has done so much in his whole career to really fight for the victims and to fight for the families, literally putting his career on the line. And he is just an incredible guy. Go and check out all of his stuff. Go on Amazon, pick up his book, Omnipotent, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Make sure you pick up that. Go and follow him wherever he's at. Check out the Fence Diaries and the episodes that he's on there and everything else that they do. But check it out. Keep up with him because he has got some incredible things that are still not yet released. So we're excited to see his new book come out and get to read about that and to see all of the evidence, because the one thing that you know you're always going to get with Bill is you're going to get every single piece of evidence. Omnipotent is incredible, and it is just evidence after evidence upon witness testimony and more witness testimony about the actual facts of what happened in and around the Gacy case. And you really need to check it out. It is incredible. But thank you guys for joining us. This has been another episode. Make sure you like, subscribe, do all those lovely things. Follow us. Make sure you comment and share this because we need to get it out there. And without you guys, it doesn't work, right? The algorithm only goes out there if you guys are engaged and you're being part of the process. So make sure you like it and share it and get it out there to everybody. I will talk to y'all in a couple more weeks. See you soon.